My name is Sasha. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Young Adult Programs Associate at Urban Adamah. I welcome you to also in the chat introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, and where you're signing in from, the indigenous lands if you know it. Just a word on the sort of multiplicity of Jewish identity and the framework of today's program. My Jewish heritage is Ashkenazi and therefore very much informed by specific practices in the Ashkenazi tradition. And our Jewish identity is really full of, it's very dynamic and multifaceted. And so just throughout this program and in all Urban Adamah programs, we really welcome and people to share if they have different traditions, if they have different ways of pronouncing things or different words for things, if they just have a different relationship with some of the themes that we're exploring, please let us know, please share that. It's really important to always be learning and centering Jewish voices that don't always get heard. So you can do that either by emailing me directly at sasha@urbanadamah.org or through the post-program survey, or even in the chat if something comes up. So without further ado, I am so excited to welcome you to this Sukkah Housing Justice panel today. This is a really exciting panel for me because Sukkot is one of my favorite holidays. Not only because it's an opportunity to strengthen community and family bonds, but also because it's a week of opportunities to reach out to our neighbors and our friends who we don't always get to engage with and we don't always invite into our lives. When we think about Sukkot, we're also, of course, thinking about the iconic sukkah, which is the temporary structure that some people build outside to pray in, to eat in, to celebrate, to sleep in during this week. And it's really important to also then think about our neighbors, some of whom, in the case of Urban Adamah, are right outside of our doors, who are building temporary structures every single day, not because it's Sukkot, but rather because it's a means of survival. And so in the spirit of extending our hand to our neighbors and our community, we are inviting you into this sort of virtual sukkah via a Zoom room today to engage in conversation about the ways that each and every one of us, regardless of, our skills, our access to income, our interests, our abilities, are able to participate and support housing justice so that we all have greater access to safe, affordable, and reliable housing. We will be taking questions at the end of the program. The first half will be roughly sort of discussion with the panelists, and then the second half will be open to questions. So again, feel free to drop those questions in the chat, and we will get to that at the end. All right. I'm gonna do a quick introduction of the panelists. When I say your name, just say hello so that your little screen pops up. But we have Alex with the East Bay Housing Organizations.
Hello.
Erin with Anti-Eviction Mapping Project.
Hi.
Talya with Love and Justice in the Streets.
Hi.
And then Mason, a historian, organizer, public health nerd, and Jewish mystic.
Hi there, everyone.
Nice. So I wanted to open this discussion and just invite each of the panelists to share a little bit about yourself and your work and what it is that you do to address the housing justice and housing crisis that we have in the Bay Area. Alex, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Sasha. And I just want to offer a brief explanation for why I am this faceless box at the moment. I typically live in Berkeley, but right now I'm calling in from Western Massachusetts, which is where I was born. That is Nipmuc and Pecumtuck territory. And you know, I mean, it's the year of climate surprises, and a couple hours ago, a 70-mile-per-hour windstorm just barreled through town and knocked the power out. So I'm calling in from a cell phone, which I thankfully managed to charge in a car, but I wish that I could see all your faces right now. So with that preamble, yeah, my name is Alex Werth. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the policy associate at an organization called East Bay Housing Organizations, or EBHO. And EBHO is a little over 35 years old. We are based in Oakland, although we work in both Alameda and Contra Costa counties. And basically, we are an advocacy organization that works mostly in the policy arena to create, preserve, and protect housing opportunities for low-income communities in the East Bay. So that's kind of our mission statement. But what does that really mean? And what does it mean to me? You know, for me, this work is about basically fighting the historic and ongoing dispossession and displacement of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, as well as poor and working people, disabled people, and others, by making sure that there's both enough housing available for people with the lowest incomes, housing that they can afford, and the people who are already housed have the resources and protections that they need in order to stay in their homes. You know, I'm of course an individual. I have a professional role at EBHO. So I'm going to be speaking today mostly from the standpoint of kind of how EBHO approaches housing justice. But to be honest, it aligns really nicely just kind of with where I'm at as an individual as well. So I'll probably be speaking more from a kind of policy perspective on this call, and I really look forward to chatting with you know, my friends and colleagues about how they kind of approach the issue. But essentially, you know, we as an organization, me as an individual, we see housing as a human right and not as a commodity that should be bought and sold and traded for profit. And this, I think, is essentially a moral vision, which it feels especially important to kind of center in sort of broad and inclusive Jewish space. But it's also a moral vision that needs to be grounded in policies and in structures. Things like rent control, laws to prevent speculation in land, and public funding for low-income housing. So we at EBHO, again, focusing on the policy angle, we pull together a really big tent of folks from the East Bay. We pull together local residents, including residents of low-income housing, people from communities of faith, housing advocates, nonprofit affordable housing developers, and community land trusts in order to organize and advocate for policies to promote housing security. And especially those policies that redress legacies of systemic racial and economic injustice. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's a really wonderful way to sort of segue also into Talya. Talya, Love and Justice in the Street also engages in policy work, but they do policy along with direct action. Can you tell us a little bit more about what y'all are engaged in and how it's either supportive of Alex or distinct?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Chag Sameach. Happy Sukkot. So my name is Talya, and I generally live in Oakland, California, and that is really the focus of the work that I have been involved with for the past 6 years, which is a small, very small organization which has recently emerged called Love and Justice in the Streets. We're all volunteer, and we raise money to be distributed to folks who are living in encampments. For the past 6 years, I have been building relationships with folks in Oakland living in encampments and supporting housed members of our community to redistribute wealth and to share the overabundance that many of us have. So that is one way that we do the work. In Oakland right now, and in many other places, we have a human rights emergency going on. We have thousands of people living in the streets of Oakland without access to water, without access to sanitation, without access to shelter. It's a human rights crisis, and as a Jewish person who's deeply connected to my Jewish traditions, I feel called to doing this work because it feels very connected to the traditions of Tikkun Olam and to many traditions that we have to draw upon, which say that we need to share resources, that say that everyone should have access to basic needs. And so that's how I come at this work. I'm also a disabled person and I'm low income myself. And so I wanted to find out creative ways that I could be a part of this, even though I don't have money to give. And so what I figured out is that I have a big mouth and an organizing background. And so what I've done is tried to leverage my relationships to both fundraise so that we can directly support folks' immediate needs, and then also amplify in housed communities the messages of unhoused folks and what they are calling for and what their needs are. So a big part of that work is listening, and then amplifying in appropriate ways, and also sharing space, being able to, because for me, it's very comfortable to go into City Hall, but for someone who's living in an encampment, that might not be comfortable. So how can we together go to City Hall to participate in meetings? So what are ways that I can leverage the privileges that I have as a white cis person who's from a middle-class background living in Oakland to shift the power dynamics. And that's a huge job to do. So the little piece that I'm really focused on is around the human rights of folks living in encampments. So the work we do is in 3 ways. One is redistribution of wealth and resources. So supporting people by providing socks, providing tents, providing water, providing food, medicine, whatever folks need at encampments. The second way that we do that work is through policy advocacy. I'm a part of the Homeless Advocacy Working Group, which in Oakland is working to push City Hall to uphold human rights. And hopefully I'll talk a little bit more about that later, what's going on right now in Oakland, because there's a huge attack on encampments. That's a policy that's coming forward that we're fighting right now. And then the third way that I've been doing this work is by accompanying people who are living in encampments are forcibly moved under police and Department of Public Works all the time. So I've been to probably between 50 and 100 encampment evictions, which we also call sweeps, to be both bearing witness, supporting the folks who are being forcibly moved to actually physically help people who are scrambling to save their things from the police and the bulldozers that are coming, and also being a buffer between police and the city. So being a liaison when I'm asked to do that role, because that's a role that is obviously a safer position for me to take on. So those are kind of the 3 areas in which the work has been being done. And again, it's all volunteer. This is very grassroots. But the other thing that I want to say is that I work really closely with 2 organizations, the East Oakland Collective, which is a Black-led organization in Deep East Oakland that is doing incredible work also around human rights at encampments. And they're doing a lot of other kinds of work as well, but we partner around encampment work, and the Village in Oakland, which is led by unhoused people themselves and is also advocating for getting land and supporting people at encampments. So the 3 of our organizations work very closely together. And so when I'm doing this work, I'm not just doing it by myself, but I'm doing it in deep partnership with folks who are directly experiencing either homelessness or poverty.
That's great. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of the sort of expanding upon the oversimplification that maybe sometimes we can get trapped in, of like housed versus unhoused, privileged versus not privileged, this idea of like there's only a couple ways to participate, and in fact instead sort of reorienting to think of like a multi-pronged approach in which we need to be engaging in this in many different ways. Mason, I would love to pass it over to you. As a fellow lifelong San Franciscan, I know you, like me, have seen and been witness to the housing crisis in the Bay Area, all of its different iterations and impacts. And also as a really committed member of this community, I would love to hear from you about the kinds of things that you have done on both an individual and collective level that that feel impactful and important to share for other folks to participate.
Yeah, of course. My name's Mason J. I also, in Jewish spaces, go by my Hebrew name, which is Yair. I am a third generation San Franciscan. I'm Black, Mexican, and Indigenous. I'm also a former foster youth. I'm a sick and disabled person, and I'm low income. So I come to the table with a lot of lived experience on the other side of what this looks like. I've also been unhoused before. I've never been on the streets, but I have been unhoused several times over the last decade. So that's kind of where my work comes from, is I approach a lot of my work from a creative perspective and a historical perspective, because I'm also a historian. So a lot of the work I do focuses on things that we in like the history nerd community kind of call not only land use, but also things like historical preservation, is getting kind of histories documented, presenting those histories to bureaucrats or district supervisors. I primarily work in San Francisco, not so much in the East Bay, and getting all that information out there. My commitment to housing justice is a lifelong one, because my family has lived at Midtown Park Apartments in San Francisco since the 70s, which is currently in the largest and longest rent strike in San Francisco history. We've been striking, I think at this point, for 6 or 7 years. So that's where I'm kind of coming from this, like literally being taught as a child how to organize and how to set up systems to make sure that people don't get displaced. I unfortunately have been booted from Midtown due to no fault of my own. And so that's really when I started getting my hat in the ring in terms of anti-eviction work. It was one of those things that I was seeing it around me. I was helping my friends move their parents out of their childhood homes and dealing with all this traumatic stuff. And I was like, well, at least we're safe. And then we weren't. And so that's kind of where it comes for me. The intersection with that and my faith is I'm a Jewish convert. So I converted by my own choice at 7.5 years old. And so I've been a practicing Jew of color for most of my life, since I was 7. And so for me, a lot of that intersection of my faith and like my upbringing comes into my work and my commitment to this idea that systems create ease and disruptions create new systems. So I consider myself kind of a housing jester, is that I create a lot of spectacles, a lot of art, a lot of provocateur stuff, a lot of street theater, a lot of what I guess could be dismissed as call-outs, but are actually interrogations and things that kind of shine the light of Jewish concepts like netzach, like enduring and using endurance, using my endurance to endure whatever happens here in San Francisco and to always come back and never be displaced is like the way my work shows up. And then, yeah, so that's pretty much what I do here. Like I don't necessarily work in the policy side. That side doesn't really concern me. I'm really on the ground. A lot of the work I do is on the ground and behind the scenes. That's, I think, a big part of my work is that I don't want to be seen, because I can get a lot more done when I'm not being seen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Mason, I really appreciate that perspective, and there's so many things from there that really resonate with me. I think that one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is like this historical preservation and also this sort of like shining light onto what's already happening, right? That when we're engaging in activism, whether it's for our own directly impacting our own community, it's for our own self to uplift the people that we are in most close community with, or it's in solidarity, it's always really important to know that, you know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Like people have been doing this for a long time, and there's so many important things to learn from both ancient wisdoms, from our Jewish practice and from our city histories that can guide the ways that we engage in the things that impact us. Erin, I think that the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project really does this really well. Can you speak to us a little bit about some of the resource building and context that y'all do?
Yeah, sure. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm I'm so inspired by all the work that everybody here is doing. So thanks for having me on. Yes, I am Erin. I go by they, them pronouns. I helped start the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in San Francisco in 2013 during a time in which a lot of friends and community members were experiencing eviction. And I think one of the big things that really animated us as a project to form were a volunteer-led collective technically housed in the San Francisco Tenants Union, which has been around for many decades. But one of the reasons we formed was that we saw a lot of people being evicted in San Francisco, also in Oakland, by these sort of shell company evictors, these LLCs, limited liability companies, and limited partnerships. And a lot of folks didn't know who their landlords were or how to figure out what other buildings their landlords owned, to organize like multi-building rent strikes. And of course, right now in the COVID moment, that's even, that's happening even more. These really beautiful multi-building rent strikes and actions that are inspirations to me. But we formed really to do some of this research and connecting work to make some of this very strange and obtuse corporate ownership data and structures more accessible and available. But yeah, that's what animated the project to form. I had gotten interested in evictions and fighting and organizing against evictions earlier though, and it's sort of interesting to think about this here, but I also come from an Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, and my mother's family is from Romania, and I think I was sort of interested in what it means to be from a diasporic people, but also a white settler in the US, what is now the US. And so I started visiting Romania to just kind of understand some of that history, and it was there well over a decade ago that I started doing housing organizing with two different community groups in Romania, and started just learning about histories of eviction and forced displacement there, mostly displacement impacting Roma communities in Romania, in part due to US imperialism there. So I think for me in this conversation too, I'm just interested in kind of thinking through what international solidarity might look like, especially in this moment when folks all over the world very differently are fighting for housing justice and fighting for exacerbated, or fighting against exacerbated context of racial dispossession, which of course predate the COVID moment, but also have been exacerbated given the way that capitalism and imperialism work. So yeah, what's also interesting about the mapping project is we formed in San Francisco and soon started doing work in Oakland too, in community and collaboration with different on the ground groups in both cities. And then a couple of years after that, folks from our collective moved back to where they were from in LA and New York. A couple of folks who had been living in the Bay Area went back home and started chapters. So we have chapters in New York, LA, and the Bay Area, and are very intentional in only producing work that's done in community and in collaboration with folks with grounded experience in those places. But in the sort of over the last 6 or 7 months, because of, again, people fighting for housing justice in kind of new ways and new scales, we've been doing more national and international work ourselves as a collective, which is new for us and something that I'm kind of always holding in tension and also inspiration. So yeah, I think that's something that I wanted to kind of think through with everybody here as well. But yeah, my own role in the mapping project has been one of mostly research around corporate ownership, which we continue to do as a collective and continue to try to produce collective knowledge around. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think one of the things that I admire the most, or I find most fascinating about the work that the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project does, is is it really does very clearly show the ways that, you know, what we're doing, or rather what's happening in the Bay Area is not happening in isolation. It's not happening in a bubble, but it is rather a national and a global issue. And so that there is ways in which when we show up in solidarity for our neighbors or in support for ourselves here, we're also doing that for people who we haven't met yet, who we don't know yet. I also really appreciate the ways in which folks are talking about, you know, the work that they do as a professional, and also some of the ways that, you know, their personal identities, histories, and contexts have informed the path that they have taken. I'm wondering if folks want to kind of discuss a little bit. I'm curious about, like, you know, if we were to speak to somebody who is engaging in this work for the first time, or trying to figure out how to engage in this work in a new way, what are some of the things that you use as, again, as both a professional and personal context? What are some of the questions that you ask yourself to inform the ways in which you engage in housing justice in the Bay Area?
Well, I guess I'll start. I think one of the ways that I engage with people who are newer to this work, I feel like oftentimes it's interesting that we talk about this, especially during Sukkot. I feel like there is a metaphor within, like, the kind of childhood stories we hear about Sukkot. Is I often think about that story of taking the gourd of wishes and then running off and ending up in the mud. And I feel like oftentimes when people are newer to this work, they feel really excited to get this wish-filled gourd and be like, I'm gonna help people who need help. And so they, like, run off into the sunset and then get into their wagon and they take off like, yeah, I'm gonna go help. And then they end up falling in a mud pit and spinning their wheels in the mud pit and being like, oh no, I need help. And then the same people they need to be helping end up pulling them out of the mud pit. Right. I think the easiest way to skirt that is to really consider what is motivating your enthusiasm. And if it's motivated by a sense of, oh, someone hasn't figured out how to do this yet, or if it's motivated by a sense of rivalry, you know, and a rivalry could be anything. It could be with someone else who's doing the work. It could be with someone who is actively opposing the identity of the people you're doing the work for. Like, but I feel like that's the common thread, is if it's a rivalry, it's motivated by rivalry. It's never focused and planned out, and it's not being approached from a higher perspective. It's being approached from a survival perspective. So I think that would be my advice to people newer to this work, is to check what is motivating their participation in the work, and then use the things that kind of reveal who they are, because housing, you know, all the things that reveal who we are and how we live as Jewish people, or even as non-Jewish people, they impact how we relate to housing and how we can show up for others. So I think those are the two biggest things, is to, like, check your motivations and to check, like, what you're doing and who you're doing this work for.
Nice. Talya, as someone who engages in a lot of you know, direct action with folks, is this something that you've seen come up you know, when doing that kind of work?
I think for me, the most important thing, as someone who's never personally experienced homelessness myself, is listening and learning, and that's going to be a constant part of the work as I'm doing this work, that is never going to stop, that I always need to be listening, and I always need to be open to learning. And then I always need to take time to reflect and to check myself as well. And I appreciate what Mason said. I think that it's important to be aware of what our intentions are doing this work. And for me, listening has been extremely powerful, because I've learned how to be more supportive of my neighbors, by not by making an assumption that I know what's right, but by being in partnership and in relationship with people. And that, of course, can look different ways depending on what kind of work we're doing, but especially doing direct redistribution work. So I started out just meeting folks in my neighborhood who are living outside and asking folks how I can support them and what they needed, and then directly responding to those requests. So for that, what that was at first in my neighborhood was people were asking for socks and people were asking for food. And so I started with that. Yeah.
Nice. Alex, I'm curious to hear, you know, what you have to say about this, coming from a more coming from the work that you're engaged in particular, being a little bit more of like a policy driven. What are some ways in which people can engage in either policy building or support that also still is like rooted and grounded in what Mason and Talya are talking about, of this sort of like individual connection?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I so appreciate being able to listen to and learn from Mason and Talya in terms of the perspective they bring from the kind of positionalities that they occupy in relationship to this work. Because I think that they're completely on point. And, you know, Sasha, what I think you're kind of getting at in this question is that, you know, engaging in this work from the policy arena, I feel is inherently fraught. You know, the policy arena, you know, exists within the structures of government that have historically been created in order to exclude and dispossess people. You know, it's for me, it's an endless paradox, because on the one hand, you know, what are the housing injustices that we're trying to remedy with housing justice? Well, many of them have been, you know, consciously created by the state or totally sanctioned by the state. So there is perhaps a paradox in trying to remedy those problems through the same governmental arena that kind of created the harms in the first place. And yet I do think that there's a lot of potency, a lot of power, and certainly a lot of resource in doing so. So it's kind of a paradox that I think that to do policy ethically, especially from you know, my positionality as a you know, kind of an owning class white cis male Ashkenazi Jew, is like you really have to hold that kind of at the core of your practice, so to speak. You know, that said, I think that there's lots of ways of doing this better, if not this, you know, or even doing it well. So as an organization, we at EBHO have, we're a membership-based organization. It's, you know, if you're a low-income person, it costs virtually nothing to become a member. And we, you know, we see our role as both like sharing knowledges, resources, opportunities for advocacy with everyone across our membership, and also kind of put it out to our membership, like what should the agenda be in the first place. So if you're an EBHO member and you live in Oakland or you live in Berkeley, we have committees that are specifically set up in order to, you know, to hear from you and kind of like learn from you about, you know, what you think our campaign should look like, what our position should be on a particular law or plan or something like that. And that's not to say that, you know, these kinds of power dynamics are not in play there. They are, and we all have to consciously work to address them. But that's sort of one way that we approach this. Another is that we have a committee that is, you know, solely composed of residents of affordable housing. And that's, you know, that's totally their space to basically caucus with one another and kind of set the agenda for what kinds of policy issues they think are more important, which then comes to the broader organization. You know, as an advocate, I have had some really personally meaningful experiences of working with people who are directly impacted by the kinds of systemic injustices that we're talking about. You know, not in the same way that Talya or Mason have talked about. But, you know, prior to this job, I was working at another organization that was leading the charge to basically end discrimination against people with criminal and incarceration histories in the housing arena, something we call fair chance housing. And the way that campaign was designed was to have formerly incarcerated people front and center, involved in every aspect of the campaign, even though it was a specific policy campaign. I mean, we had to change laws in order to force landlords to stop checking for criminal background and stop discriminating against those folks. But what I learned in that experience is that, and I think Mason kind of spoke to this earlier, talking about a survival perspective, when you have people for whom this is a life or death question in the room or on the board or whatever it is, then they are simply not going to be willing to compromise on things that matter deeply to their survival and well-being. They're not going to be willing to bargain away, and allow for a law to be watered down or something like that. When the stakes are that high, yeah, because the stakes are different, and for a lot of professional advocates, a lot of people with privilege, that's simply not true. So I just think that moving always more towards that model of doing policy is partially how we kind of transform this thing from the inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that really relates to what Mason was saying earlier about this sort of self-reflection piece that comes into all activism, right? Is like, what is your intention? What is the reason that you're doing this? Is it, and as you get into the sort of, for lack of a better way of saying, higher up decision-making circles, you get more and more agendas and the stakes become different. And Alex, I really appreciate you speaking to that directly to say, that's a pitfall that we see, but it's also avoidable and something that, we can also structure around and be cognizant of, to think, why is somebody, like you said, like less willing to compromise on one issue versus another? Is it because it directly impacts them and the stakes are high and therefore, they don't have alternatives? Or is it not directly impacting them and is rather potentially connected to something else that's going on that is either seen or unseen? I'm curious to hear from folks, and there's so many dynamic ways that you are all engaging and participating in this. We're hearing now, like, policy, we're hearing direct action, we're hearing sort of the like everyday acts of kindness and generosity and neighborliness. And then we're also hearing like, just resource building, like building the information, historical information, the context, the numbers. What, if you were to say like one or two things that were the most immediate needs in your community, what would you say that those were?
Well, housing, shelter, now, in terms of who the population that I'm working with, and one of the things that the Homeless Advocacy Working Group has been fighting for the past 4 years is access to water and to sanitation. Mm-hmm. Because right now, most folks who are living unsheltered in the streets of Oakland specifically, and also in many other places, but I know Oakland, do not have access to safe and sanitary places to use the bathroom or to have access to fresh water. Mm-hmm. And the city has consistently refused to put money into that, and instead chooses to again and again put money into policing and to the system of police in our city.
Yeah. And Talya, I know you were speaking earlier about, the sort of the very direct and important action of, asking the people who you see who are clearly in need, what do you need? And then providing it for them. During this COVID-19 time where some of our friends and family don't feel so comfortable approaching somebody they don't know, or maybe not even leaving the house, what are some ways that people can, still meet that need in a less face-to-face way?
So for people who have access to resources or for people who know other folks who have access to resources, I think that it's really important that we be giving tzedakah right now, that we be sharing our resources. And Love and Justice in the Streets, 100% of the money in our that we raise goes directly to people living in encampments and in the streets of Oakland, and sometimes Berkeley as well. So that's one way is to really be making that, like, can you afford to purchase one tent a month? Like, what is it that you, to really reflect on what you have access to, and not everyone does. I'm on disability, I'm very low income, but I can give a little bit of my own money, and I can also talk to other people and invite them to give. And so that's what I do. So it's not something that if you don't have access, that means you can't be involved. There's many, many ways to be involved, of course. And so that's one. Another thing is, I think, which I think we're talking about at the end, but is learning, is following those who are directly impacted. So following organizations and amplifying their work through social media, I think is a really important way that folks can be connecting. And you know, there's right now, for folks who are housed and have access to internet, being on Zoom and going to city council and speaking up and sharing and not just letting things go by. I think that there's a real tendency to be kind of being very insular right now. People are protecting themselves and their families who have the privilege to do that. And what that means is that we have thousands of people who've been left in the streets, who are going to either get exposed to COVID or are very high risk of being exposed to COVID and death. The other thing I wanted to just bring up and let folks know about is that since the pandemic started, Love and Justice in the Streets partnered with the East Oakland Collective and the Village and have started a program called Hotels Not Graves, which is specifically to raise funds to shelter people in hotel rooms who have no access to shelter right now. So for the past several months, we've been sheltering over 30 people, pregnant women, moms with little children, very severely vulnerable seniors, and disabled folks. And it's only 30 people, but it's a model of how community can step up and just take care of each other when the government fails to do that. So it's a small scale, but it also is, it's showing that there's possibilities, and it's also a direct critique of the lack of action from our governments in taking care of the most vulnerable people in our communities.
I want to also extend the same question to some of the other panelists, and also extend an invitation to our guests to either write in the chat a question, or even just raise your hand if that's easier to ask a question. I want to be mindful of time and make sure that everyone gets to sort of like engage with this in the way that feels important. But yeah, so first and foremost, thinking about sort of from our other panelists, Mason, Erin, Alex, like what are the most immediate needs that you're seeing, and how are some ways that we can kind of plug into that?
Yeah, there's 5 immediate ones that always come to mind when people ask this question. The first one is probably to nourish the people who are overworked in your community, because those are the people who are doing like the most legwork and the most stuff, is to take care of the people who are doing the work if you cannot do that work or participate in it in yourself. And then another one would be to like exchange energy to create abundance, kind of adopting this almost mythological role of like trader or messenger is a very helpful way to show up. I think moving beyond the ancestral patterns of silence around what you have is a big one. I feel like especially Jewish folks, because of whatever guilt we might possess, whether we are people of color or not, about being Jewish and already existing on some sort of, at least in some capacities, a marginalized axis. There's often a lot of silence around what people are working with. And so just being honest with like what you're coming to the table with in terms of resources. And that's not always money. That could be social capital. That could be, in my case, people like me who have educational capital. most politicians under the table. And while I don't have much money at all, in fact, I'm running a GoFundMe just to stay housed right now myself, I'm able to do that kind of work. And then I think the last kind of one, or I guess the fourth one, would be to, think about what you need to release and also share to bring justice to the world around you. Because I feel like people don't often consider like what they need to get rid of. They're just like, the whole system's bad, let's get rid of it. But it's like, there's actually a lot of stuff that we need to unlearn and like take out of our kind of, what I like to call energetic hygiene. Like we need to have better energetic hygiene practices before we can actually successfully do this work. And then the last one would be to just realize that, like, I know this is like a weird metaphor, but we are actually birthing a new world in this time right now. And so to like figure out, like, if you were in a delivery room, what role you would want to take. Like, do you want to be the doctor that catches the baby? Do you want to be the person who runs out and tells everyone the baby's been born? Do you want to be like, how do you want to show up in that way? Like, how do you want to show up for people in that kind of way? Because it's like, it's a breech birth, it's messy, and it's in a public hospital, and we're all stuck here. So like, how are you going to be in a delivery room?
That's such a good metaphor. I really, really appreciate that. Yeah, and I also just want to like second Mason. I have seen you do this a lot, and I think it's incredibly important, right? Like the care for the people who are committed to the work. Not all of us are going to be, like out there on the streets, up on our soapbox. Like not all of us are agitators, and that's okay, right? But like there's probably someone in your life who is, and that person is probably working really hard. And that's a less direct, but in some ways can be more impactful to say, have you eaten? Can I bring you food? Have you rested? Where, whatever love language that person has, I think it's also really important to create a system where the people who are really deeply committed to this kind of stuff can be nourished and resourced and not burn out, right? Because that's a huge thing. That's a big problem we see. And I also really enjoyed what you were saying also about this sort of like, right, the different levels of access and privilege. And Erin, I was hoping you could speak a little bit to like what the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is, really engaging in, or what's the most immediate needs, because I think one of the benefits of that project is that it is ongoing. There's a lot of like research-based stuff. There's a lot of sort of less physical, but equally important work that people can engage in if that's the kind of thing that suits them. So yeah, same question, like what are the most immediate needs that you're seeing in your community?
Yeah, I love what Talya and Mason said, and everybody here is brilliant. I think in terms of the mapping project, like the folks who make up the collective, I mean, people are coming from different types of privilege or lack thereof, different generations, different many things, but and we are a volunteer-based collective, so a lot of folks are volunteering whatever time they have, but some of us do have access to certain types of like technology, whether that's map making technology or data analysis technology, and access to different tools that make sharing some of the data easier. So I think often what we do in our collective is figure out how do we leverage the privileges that we have or that we can bring together to return data or maps. Or we also do a lot of oral history and narrative, zine making, mural making work, things like that. But how do we take whatever privileges we have and whatever knowledge we're able to gain collectively through our other community commitments and coalitions that we're a part of to produce work that is meaningful and that could help materialize change. And yeah, I think like one of the things we're constantly coming up against is that it's often very, very hard for folks to know like what their rights are, especially right now. Policies keep on changing every single day, and it's like one day you might think that you're not going to get evicted or you can't get evicted, and then the next day you think, oh, maybe I will get evicted, or people don't know if they're accumulating unpayable debt, as was the case during the subprime mortgage crisis or not. And that's not something that yeah, it's easy to answer because the policies are so wonky and can get really complicated really quickly. So one of the things we're trying to do is, as best we can, distill information and make it more tangible, just to answer some of the basic questions folks might be having, like who is my landlord, which should be easier to answer than unfortunately it is, or like has my landlord evicted in the past, what other buildings does my landlord own, what are my rights as a tenant right now, given whatever kind of like building I might be living in or whatever city I'm living in. So yeah, that's some of what we're doing. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the questions that are coming up for me are like, are you, when you're saying about like oral histories, like, have you been living in a neighborhood for a long time and have good connections that you should be encouraging are being documented and shared of stories that people have had? Are you like a statistician or somebody who is a little bit more oriented towards numbers, and that's a skill you have and you're really good at sort of accumulating that work? Great, then there's a sort of space and a resource for that particular skill in this. Or maybe, you're not a housing lawyer, but you're another kind of lawyer. You've had experience with law, because often it's like translating the information is one of the things that I see being the greatest need, especially in the sort of housing justice for people who are housed, for renters. It's like new laws come out, new policy comes out all the time, and it's not always clear even to the sharpest legal mind what that impact is. And so again, kind of going into this thing of like the questions that you ask yourself, right? Like, where are your skills? And there will be a thing that you can apply it to. There is a way in which your skills and your talents can be used. I wanna honor also, Deborah has a question here. She writes, in terms of small scale resources, is there any good way to connect empty rooms in houses with unhoused populations? Nice. Does anybody, and of course, question to the panelists, but also I'll open it up to the group, is saying, does anybody know of ways to connect empty rooms in homes with unhoused populations?
There's large, pretty mainstream and often highly problematic organizations that are doing work around housing, and they may have a way to connect someone. If you're looking to share a room, I would say, like in the Bay Area or in the East Bay Area Community Services, BACS is one of those organizations. I don't specifically know of anyone who's doing that, but that would be the organization that I would say might be who to reach out to. BACS, Bay Area Community Services.
I'll also plug that, there's resources like SF Chalkboard, in which, I read often. There are calls, kind of tying back to what Mason was talking about like, are you supporting directly? Or are you supporting the person who is doing the supporting? I see a lot on SF Chalkboard, different people, individuals who are saying, hey, I need housing for this amount of time, or I lost my housing and I'm like, bouncing around at risk of being homeless. Do you have a room I can stay in? And I think that kind of community effort is also a really nice way to plug in. And it offers you a lot of sort of different resources. So that's SF Chalkboard, in which a lot of people are making calls, community calls.
I'd also chime in that there's also a lot of people who do this, but it's like not one of those things where you're going to find like a group or an organization to sign up with. It involves being involved in your community, because I do know that there are houses here in San Francisco who are collective houses that keep one room open for someone who's either recovering from surgery or is in between housing, or is even before COVID, was visiting for an extended period of time, but didn't have the money to pay rent and, be here. So I think that's a great way to do it, is to kind of create a system within even your own neighborhood, because that's the thing. It's like one thing to have a room that's open and invite someone who doesn't have a house into it. But it's another thing to have that person be in your Like, you know, your neighbor is going to welcome that person with the same kind of zeal that you have for like extending your home. That's where it gets tricky, is that you have to have everyone in your environment on board. That includes your neighbors, that includes the local police, the people who are next door being like, oh, there's a homeless people in the neighborhood, you know, stuff like that, because that has happened. I guess maybe last year at this point, but there was a homeless couple who had been granted access to a room in the Piedmont Hills, and then the police were getting called on them every time they were going to the home that had been open to them.
Right.
So it's one of those things that like you really have to get your community on board and let them know, hey, this is something we're doing. Like, not do you consent to it, but like, hey, this is what we're doing because we recognize a problem. So it doesn't create like any friction. But I think that's a great thing, and I would love to see more of that, because I'm like, an empty room where? like, you know, like there are people who need rooms. There are hundreds of people who need rooms, or even posting on a board, like, you know, on some sort of platform online that like, hey, I have this room, it like comes with these conditions, and like setting up what you want the framework to be like, so you don't just get a billion people who like want to stay in the room, because it really needs to have a solid framework for it to be successful for both you and whoever you're helping.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to reiterate some of the questions that I was hearing be suggested to ask, right? Which is, who do you want to serve? What is your capacity to serve, or to you know, make this offering available? And also, who is this going to impact, or who may potentially get in the way of you know, this act that you want to do? And how do you you know, avoid that conflict, specifically also for the sake of the person who you're supporting, right? Because I think that it can be traumatic, to be frank, to have to deal with the feeling of being unwanted after settling into some semblance of comfort when you do feel wanted. Any other questions? Questions either in the chat, or go ahead and unmute yourself if you're thinking about things. And to the panelists as well, before we kind of transition into our closing, if there's anything else that you want to speak to or add or plug, this would be a great time. We're also, just as a reminder, we're going to send a resource sheet out by tomorrow with some of the sort of things that we were talking about. But
Can I jump in for a second, Sasha?
yeah, please.
Yeah, so in terms of the question about what are the biggest challenges and needs that we're kind of seeing in our work right now, and how might folks on this call or who see the recording be able to kind of get plugged into that? You know, as I think has already been mentioned, COVID-19 took an already broken and highly unjust housing system and is just kind of like smashed it over the shoals. And so what we're really trying to do is to combat a massive wave of evictions and foreclosures that to some extent have started, but could certainly get a lot worse due to the way that this economic crisis is kind of rippling through the housing system for people who are housed. You know, this would really be this would really just be a tragedy and kind of an epidemic within an epidemic, and could also replicate some of the worst aspects of what happened in the last housing crisis. For folks who remember 2008, 2009, with this massive wave of foreclosure that was disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities because of predatory lending, that gave an opportunity for big corporate investors and housing corporations to sweep in and basically buy up all the housing stock that kind of formerly belonged to that community. So we need to fight back against that. We need to not just stop people from being evicted or foreclosed upon, but we also need to find a way of canceling or forgiving the massive amount of owed rent or owed mortgage payments that are now kind of accruing on the shoulders of individuals and families. You know, it's going to take a huge amount of resources in order to be able to do that. in a way that doesn't destabilize the housing system further. And at the same time, we have, we're facing a lot of austerity conditions in local cities like Oakland, or if you look at local county governments, and with just absolute callousness coming from the federal government in terms of no willingness to kind of help out. So the plug that I want to make is, for people who are sort of inclined towards, activities like calling their elected officials, tuning into those city council meetings and voting, there are a lot of opportunities to get involved. And we really need a mass mobilization around making sure that people who are housed are able to remain housed and they don't come out of this thing with a lot of debt. And so just two specific ways of doing that, especially here at the local level, if you're eligible to vote, or if you're inclined towards voting, and I hope that if you are eligible to vote, that you will vote, there's a bunch of housing issues coming up on our ballots, which many of you might have already received. And two really important ones I want to highlight are, one, Proposition 15, which is a statewide move to end loopholes for corporate property owners to bring billions more dollars to our local governments. And the other for voters in Alameda County is something called Measure W, which is a half-cent sales tax, which is not my favorite tax by any means, but a half-cent sales tax to raise hundreds of millions of dollars that are meant to fund housing first solutions to homelessness. So we really need those resources at our local government to help bail out, to create a people's bailout, since the federal government is leaving us high and dry. And so I think that Urban Adamah will be able to share some resources, which I shared, to, if you're interested in that, how you can sign up to phone bank in support of those two measures.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, well, Jesse, speaking of sharing resources, will you screen share? So here's just a little list, just a very small list of resources. And I'm gonna just kind of, as we close out, this program is scheduled until 10 after, but I'm gonna offer that before anyone leaves, that they consider and answer in the chat this question, which I just shared in the chat. And if you're having trouble getting to it, if you go to I think it's the lower left hand of your sort of menu bar, you'll see a little speech bubble that says chat if you can't see it, and they'll help it pop up. But the question is, what is one commitment you will make to support affordable, accessible, permanent housing in our community? So some resources that we have talked about and some that we haven't yet talked about today, but you can either donate to or become a member of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, East Bay Housing Organizations, or Love and Justice in the Streets. These organizations all also have volunteer opportunities, albeit have been changed a little since COVID-19, but they're there. So you can plug in, and as Talya said, even just following on social media is actually really great to plugging into other opportunities that will align with your interests and needs. I have the phone banking that Alex was talking about. I hope I got this right, Alex, but yes on Prop 15 and yes on County Measure W.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that. You're right.
Okay, cool. I again, some of us are more legally inclined than others, and I was just hoping that I was right in that situation. Then there's also so many different forms of direct action. As Talya was talking about, you could either donate funds so that folks who are houseless have tents, blankets, socks and shoes, some of the really bare necessities of survival, or look around your home, and if you have a lot of those things, or maybe you bought a tent and you've only gone camping once, maybe that's a better served for somebody who's going to be using it, as we were talking about, every day. So you can donate your resources to folks, either monetary or actual things. You can engage in a lot of free food distribution. If you have a home or a business that has a sidewalk that is accessible, Oakland Town Fridge is incredible. You can set up a refrigerator in front of your home or business that people can keep stocked with fresh food and different vegetables. You can also stock it with pre-made meals for those who don't have access to a kitchen. Soul Tree Alchemy and the Free Farm Stand are both resources for free food distribution, which you can either volunteer for or give to if you have a community garden. Soul Tree is in Oakland, and they do their distribution on Sundays from 3 to 5. The Free Farm Stand is in San Francisco in the Mission District on Sundays at noon, and both accept donations from neighbors. If you, for example, have a lemon tree or mini chards or other food resources that you have, or love to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and want to bring it every Sunday. You can join or establish a tenants union. And you can join a demonstration if that's something that feels safe for you and called to. The United Front Against Displacement has 2 coming up. One is on October 13 to protect against illegal evictions at the Wood Street encampment. It starts at 5 a.m., but it's planned to go on all day. So you can come out there and meet the folks. You see, we have, they also have the demand encampment management reform. So engaging with the Oakland City politicians. We're meeting at Oakland City Hall, 1 p.m. on October 10th. And that's another way to sort of show up in a really direct way. I am seeing Mason also say, yeah, hygiene products and cases of water during this time, N95 masks. Without the valve is really important. Yeah, just some of the things that, think about, like, what are some of the things that we take for granted as having that are actually vital resources for folks? And again, that means either being a place where you receive that and then distribute it, or maybe you're the person who is purchasing those things and donating it. But those are just some ideas. And again, the invitation as we close out this afternoon is to answer the question in the chat. What is one commitment that you will make to support affordable, accessible, and permanent housing in our community? Please consider something and share with us before you leave. I have from Pat, I went to Love and Justice in the Streets to make a contribution, but the website is not currently able to make donations.
I just checked on that. I think you just have to, if you click on the donate button, it'll take you to a GoFundMe page, and that's how we collect donations, is through the GoFundMe page.
Nice. Thank you, Tessa. So, Dina, Tessa, Anya, Zoe. As you say goodbye, as we leave our Zoom Sukkah, our virtual Sukkah, please, one commitment or one idea can be an action that you're going to take, or something you're going to investigate further, like Pat's question about how to donate. We'll keep the room open for just a couple more minutes. But thank you all so much for coming here today. Thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Talya. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Jesse, for, of course, always being my Zoom partner in crime. And happy Sukkot. Thank you all.